Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, February 3rd, 2022. President Joe Biden says the leader of the violent terrorist group ISIS has been killed in an overnight raid by U.S. military forces in northwest Syria, and the leader blew himself and his family members up rather than surrender, President Biden calling it a final act of desperate cowardice. A new U.S. accusation against Russia that it is trying to fake a reason to invade Ukraine. Former employees of Washington's NFL team, now known as the Commanders, tell Congress about sexual misconduct and harassment they say they endured on the job, including one describing new sexual assault accusations against team owner Dan Snyder. A new Justice Department anti-gun violence effort cracking down on home-assembled firearms known as ghost guns. They're difficult to trace. President Biden joining Attorney General Merrick Garland in New York City, along with city mayor and state governor. Potential new 5G threat to airlines, not from the ground towers, but from passengers leaving their 5G phones on during flights. And the annual National Prayer Breakfast brings together Washington leaders of both parties, all ahead on Washington Today. This from CNN.com. President Biden watched in real time Wednesday as U.S. commandos landed in Syria to raid a 3-story home surrounded by olive trees where the top leader of ISIS was living with his wife and members of his family. From the head of the Situation Room table, Biden watched anxiously as an American helicopter suffered mechanical problems on the ground. There was relief in the room when children emerged from the first floor of the building running to safety. Moments later, an explosion rocked the site, a suicide detonation that killed the leader, his wife, and children, blowing their bodies outside the building and onto the surrounding land. The details of how Biden monitored the raid came from senior administration officials who recounted it in detail on Thursday morning. That from CNN. Later in the morning, President Biden making a statement from the White House.
Last night, operating on my orders, the United States military forces successfully removed a major terrorist threat to the world, the global leader of ISIS, known as Haji Abdullah. He took over as leader of ISIS in 2019 after the United States counterterrorism operation killed al-Baghdadi. Since then, ISIS has directed terrorist operations targeting Americans, our allies, and our partners, and countless civilians in the Middle East, Africa, and in South Asia. Haji Abdullah oversaw the spread of ISIS-affiliated terrorist groups around the world after savaging communities and murdering innocents. He was responsible for the recent brutal attack on a prison in northeast Syria holding ISIS fighters, which was swiftly addressed by our brave partners in the Syrian Democratic Forces. He was the driving force behind the genocide of the Yazidi people in northwestern Iraq in 2014. We all remember the gut-wrenching stories, mass slaughters that wiped out entire villages, thousands of women and young girls sold into slavery, rape used as a weapon of war. And thanks to the bravery of our troops, this horrible terrorist leader is no more. Our forces carried out the operation with their signature preparation and precision, and I directed the Department of Defense to take every precaution possible to minimize civilian casualties. Knowing that this terrorist had chosen to surround himself with families, including children, we made a choice to pursue a special forces raid at a much greater risk than to our own people, rather than targeting him with an airstrike. We made this choice to minimize civilian casualties. Our team is still compiling the report, but we do know that as our troops approach to capture the terrorist, in a final act of desperate cowardice, he, with no regard to the lives of his own family or others in the building, he chose to blow himself up, not just to the vest, but to blow up that 3rd floor, rather than face justice for the crimes he has committed, taking several members of his family with him, just as his predecessor did. I'm grateful for the immense courage and skill and determination of our U.S. forces, who skillfully executed this incredibly challenging mission. The members of our military are the solid steel backbone of this nation, ready to fly into danger at a moment's notice to keep our country and the American people safe, as well as our allies. And I'm also grateful to the families of our service members. You serve right alongside these soldiers and sailors, Marines, Special Forces, the loved ones, giving them the strength and support they need to do what they do. To our service members and their families, We're forever grateful for what you do for us, and we owe you a debt. Thank you. We're also aided by the essential partnership of the Syrian Democratic Forces. I want to commend our dedicated intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and members of our national security team throughout the government, whose meticulous and tireless work over the course of many months ensured that this mission succeeded. This operation is testament to America's reach and capability to take out terrorist threats no matter where they try to hide anywhere in the world.
President Biden making a statement at the White House Thursday morning. Another description of Wednesday's raid, this from the New York Times. They write, American helicopters ferried the commandos into position after midnight, surrounding a house at Atme, a town close to the border with Turkey and rebel-held Idlib province, according to eyewitnesses, social media reports, and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a conflict monitor based in Britain. A tense standoff briefly ensued, with loudspeakers blaring warnings in Arabic for everyone in the house to surrender, neighbors said. Then an explosion rocked the building. After that, some of the house's occupants had not emerged, and a major battle erupted with heavy machine gun fire and apparent missile strikes. After about 3 hours, the American commandos and the remaining helicopters flew off, witnesses said. Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby telling reporters today that U.S. forces were able to evacuate 10 civilians from the building, including several children, and, quote, to the degree there's a loss of innocent lives, it's caused by Abdullah and his lieutenants. Here's part of the Pentagon briefing. The questions from Associated Press national security reporter Robert Burns.
If I heard you, did I hear you correctly that you said you verified 3 civilians were killed? And also, could you elaborate on, perhaps explain a little further what Secretary Austin meant in his written statement about looking into the possibility that U.S. actions may have resulted in harm to civilians? What exactly is he referring to there?
So we know that that when Abdullah detonated an explosive device, which obviously killed him, we know that there were 3 people on that 3rd floor with him that were also killed. His wife and 2 children. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the 3. We also know, as I said, that we were able to safely evacuate 10 individuals, 6 from the 1st floor, an adult male, an adult female, and 4 children, and then 4 children from the 2nd floor, which our forces were able to safely get out of the building. On that 2nd floor, where one of Abdullah's lieutenants engaged our forces, actually one of his lieutenants and the lieutenant's wife firing back at our forces. They were killed, and it appears as if a child was also killed on that 2nd floor. And as for your second question, I mean, we're always mindful of the potential for civilian harm or harm to innocent life. And while the strong indications are here is that the lives taken in this operation, the lives of innocents taken in this operation, were caused by Abdullah and his decision to blow himself up and everybody else with him on that 3rd floor, as well as the resistance of his lieutenant on the 2nd floor. We're willing to take a look, to just examine and make sure that there wasn't any action that we might have taken that could have also caused harm to innocents.
You mean indirectly, or do you mean directly?
In any way. I think we're just going to take a look and see. But right now, the strong indications are that to the degree there's a loss of innocent life, it's loss caused by Mr. Abdullah and his lieutenant.
You're quite confident on the 3, that's only 3 people that were...
That's what we have right now, Bob. I'm going to give you what I can right now, and I think you know that information can change over time. That's what we have right now.
The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby being questioned by Bob Burns, reporter with AP. The Syria Civil Defense and Aid Group, also known as the White Helmets, says at least 13 people have been killed during this operation, including 4 women and 6 children. Some reaction from Congress. First, the Democratic leaders. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer opened the Senate with this.
Earlier this morning, Madam President, Americans learned that thanks to the skill and bravery of our armed forces, we have taken off the battlefield the leader, the world leader of ISIS. I want to thank the incredible work of our brave military service members who work day and night to keep Americans safe. So many have suffered at the brutal hand of ISIS. Senators will learn more about the operation later this morning during our classified all-senators briefing with Secretary Austin and other senior administration officials.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, began her weekly briefing with reporters talking about the raid.
As you all know, according to the President's statement this morning, last night America delivered justice to the leader of ISIS and struck a serious blow to the terrorist group. Our entire nation is grateful for the patriotism of our military, personnel, and intelligence community. It was a successful strike. Strike was a strong step toward the fight against ISIS, but the death of this ISIS leader does not mean the death of ISIS. Congress remains ironclad in our commitment to our national security, and we will continue to work closely with the administration to defeat this terrorist state and keep America and our allies safe. Today, we are having previously scheduled classified briefing by the cabinet officers. At the beginning of that briefing, I have been told that we will have a briefing from Secretary Austin about the strike of last night. But it's so sad because this leader of the ISIS, maybe it's what they believe or whatever, but he decided that he would blow himself up and his children and his family with him as well. That's what happened last night.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi starting her weekly briefing with reporters. As she mentioned, there were closed-door briefings. It was originally scheduled to be on Russia and Ukraine, but this was added both for the senators and then for the House members, secretaries of defense and state briefing, along with the Director of National Intelligence and others. A few Senate Republicans spoke with reporters as they were heading into that briefing. Mitt Romney of Utah and Rick Scott of Florida.
From the reports that we've seen from the White House, the strike in Syria was a success, and we've removed an ISIS commander, and that's very good news. Obviously, ISIS is a great threat to our interests, not only in the Middle East, but around the world.
We want to do everything we can to stop terrorism, and so I would appreciate the administration. We'll get better information on exactly what happened. So anything we can do to eliminate leaders from ISIS or Al-Qaeda or, in my opinion, Taliban, I think we ought to be doing.
Were you aware that this was in the works, or was this a surprise to you last night when they went out as well?
It was a surprise to me.
Do you expect to hear anything about Syria?
We probably will, yeah.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks.
Senators Rick Scott, before that Mitt Romney, both Republicans, stopping by to speak with reporters as they were heading into that classified briefing. As we mentioned, originally to be on the situation between Russia and Ukraine and those tensions, but expanded to include the raid in Syria. Well, Senator Jim Risch of Idaho is ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he spoke with reporters about the briefing about Russia, continuing to position military troops on Ukraine's border, and the U.S. and NATO responding by moving more troops and equipment to Eastern Europe and threatening sanctions, and Senator Risch mentioning a Russia sanctions bill that's being negotiated in the Senate.
In the Ukraine briefing today, obviously, from what you heard, are you more concerned about an invasion now than you were, say, a week ago?
That isn't a good way to put it. There is a concern, and it is a serious concern. I think the briefing was very comprehensive today, unlike some of them that we get. It was very informative, I think, for all members. As you know, we're getting close on a bill and should have that before too long. And we've engaged all of the decision makers in that, so we're comfortable with that. Diplomacy is still a door that's open. I would strongly recommend that Putin think about that, and once he sees where we're going, once our bill is put out there, I think he's probably going to have second thoughts about it and should. The administration is moving in parallel with us. So those are all moving parts right now.
Do you expect that this sanctions bill will include pre-invasion sanctions?
You know, I'm not talking about details at this point. Senator Menendez and I are negotiating this in good faith. Any issue can be resolved if the parties have two things. Number one, a common objective, and number two, acting in good faith. That's happening right now. We are moving in good faith towards a resolution of this, and we'll have it very soon.
You guys leave today without having a deal yet, or you have a framework, or do you think it'll be more like next week?
Look, these things are complex to write, particularly when you're trying to do it congruently with outside factors, other people that have a say in this. So these take some time, and we really don't want to get ahead of ourselves on this, but we're going to have something for you pretty quick.
And SWIFT sanctions have been mentioned as a possibility.
Yeah.
Is that something that it's still...
Again, I don't want to talk about the exact details of it, but certainly everybody knows that involved in this will be very, very significant financial matters that will come to bear heavily.
Senator Jim Risch is ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, speaking with reporters after the closed-door classified briefing with members of the administration, including the Defense Secretary, Secretary of State, and Director of National Intelligence. He is negotiating that Russia sanctions bill with, among others, Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, who chairs the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, telling Newsy that the key issue is whether the sanctions should be imposed on Russia now or only after an invasion, if it happens, of Ukraine. From the Associated Press, the U.S. accusing the Kremlin on Thursday of an elaborate plot to fabricate an attack by Ukrainian forces that Russia could use as a pretext to take military action against its neighbor. It's the latest allegation by the U.S. and Britain that Russia is plotting to use a false pretext to go to war against Ukraine. More from the State Department with spokesman Ned Price.
We have previously noted our strong concerns regarding Russian disinformation and the likelihood that Moscow might seek to create, a false flag operation to initiate military activity. Now, we can say that the United States has information that Russia is planning to stage fabricated attacks by Ukrainian military or intelligence forces as a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine. One possible option the Russians are considering, and which we made public today, involves the production of a propaganda video, a video with graphic scenes of false explosions depicting corpses, crisis actors pretending to be mourners, and images of destroyed locations or military equipment, entirely fabricated by Russian intelligence. To be clear, the production of this propaganda video is one of a number of options that the Russian government is developing as a fake pretext to initiate and potentially justify military aggression against Ukraine. We don't know if Russia will necessarily use this or another option in the coming days. We are publicizing it now, however, in order to lay bare the extent of Russia's destabilizing actions towards Ukraine and to dissuade Russia from continuing this dangerous campaign and ultimately launching a military attack. Russia has signaled it's willing to continue diplomatic talks as a means to de-escalate, but actions such as these suggest otherwise. We will continue to diligently work together with our allies and partners to expose Russian disinformation and other hybrid tactics used against Ukraine. We continue to work to prevent any effort Moscow might make to justify further military action in Ukraine. We again urge Russia to stop its destructive and destabilizing disinformation campaign, to de-escalate tensions, and to engage in diplomacy and dialogue for a peaceful solution.
The State Department spokesman Ned Price at his briefing. The Russian government-funded news site RT has the headline, Washington gets grilled over Russia false flag claims. The State Department alleges Moscow prepared crisis actor video to invade Ukraine but refuses to offer evidence. You're listening to Washington Today. From CBS News. 6 former employees of the Washington NFL football team joined leaders of the U.S. House of Representatives Oversight Committee on Thursday for a roundtable discussion about workplace misconduct inside the organization. 7 months after the NFL announced the completion of its own investigation into the franchise, the roundtable unveiled both new allegations, including claims of inappropriate behavior by team owner Daniel Snyder, and a renewed commitment to potential legislative solutions focused on holding the NFL and Washington's perpetrators of sexual harassment accountable. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, Democrat from New York, is the committee chair and one of the hosts of the roundtable.
We should be able to agree on the fact that sexual harassment will not stop and workplaces like the Washington Commanders will not improve unless there are clear consequences for those who engage in this unlawful behavior and try to cover it up. No individual, no corporation, and certainly no employer should be able to bully or threaten victims into silence. But without transparency, this conduct will continue unabated. Recent events have laid bare how much remains to be done to protect people from sexual harassment in the workplace. In 1964, Congress passed Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which banned sex discrimination in the workplace. But nearly 3 decades later, the Me Too movement exposed that sexual harassment in the workplace is still occurring and that many victims go years without justice or accountability. Powerful men like Harvey Weinstein and even former President Trump have used non-disclosure agreements to conceal their sexual misconduct and buy victim silence. Many large employers have done the same to cover up sexual harassment and other illegal workplace abuse. According to the National Women's Law Center, more than 1/3 of American workers are bound by some form of non-disclosure agreement. It is time for Congress to empower victims and make it harder for serial harassers to hide. Today, we will hear from 6 courageous people who decided to speak out about the toxic work environment they experienced at their former employer, the Washington football team. We will hear firsthand accounts of how for nearly 2 decades, under the leadership of team owner Daniel Snyder, women were touched inappropriately, degraded based on their appearance, and verbally abused on a near daily basis. We will hear that some of this abuse involved senior executives at the team. And we will hear how women suffered in silence because they feared retaliation or were bound by confidentiality agreements. And because of the Washington football team and the NFL failed to create procedures to safely report these incidents.
Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney at today's roundtable. C-SPAN aired it live, and you can find the 2-hour video archived at cspan.org. One of those 6 former employees of Washington's NFL franchise testifying about her experience, Tiffany Johnston, and she made new allegations against team owner Dan Snyder.
I began working for the Washington football team in 2002 after a team executive approached me and presented me with an opportunity. He said he was creating a new position with the club-level tickets team, a marketing and events coordinator, and he had me in mind from our interactions at team events while I was a cheerleader. He and I went to breakfast to discuss the opportunity, and after lots of conversations with my parents, I was in my early 20s after all, and with my boss at Booz Allen Hamilton, I decided if there ever was a time to leave a distinguished, incredibly professional company like Booz Allen to take a job with an NFL team now in my early 20s was the time. Boy, did I learn a lot at the Washington football team under top executives and Dan Snyder. Let me share some of the highlights I learned during my tenure with the team. I learned what a pearl necklace is while in a marketing meeting with my boss and male coworkers. And it's not the kind you receive from your grandmother at 8th grade graduation. For those of you who didn't know, like my mom, it's an offensive sexual term. I learned from another high-level executive that I should wear low-cut blouses when making sales pitches to potential suite owners. Apparently, it generates faster sales. I also learned from this same executive that the best way to avoid an uncomfortable situation in front of potential suite owners is to just do what my boss asks, which on one occasion involved him tossing me in the air to do a cheerleader stunt for a client while I was wearing a skirt. I learned on one specific occasion that when I was asked by my boss to attend a networking event, and to dress cute, It was actually an orchestration by him and Dan Snyder to put me in a compromising sexual situation. I learned that placing me strategically by the owner at a work dinner after this networking event was not for me to discuss business, but to allow him, Dan Snyder, to place his hand on my thigh under the table. I learned how to discreetly remove a man's unwanted hand from my thigh at a crowded dinner table at a busy restaurant to avoid a scene. I learned that job survival meant I should continue my conversation with another coworker rather than call out Dan Snyder right then in the moment. I also learned later that evening how to awkwardly laugh when Dan Snyder aggressively pushed me towards his limo with his hand on my lower back, encouraging me to ride with him to my car. I learned how to continue to say no, even though a situation was getting more awkward, uncomfortable, and physical. I learned that the only reason Dan Snyder removed his hand from my back and stopped pushing me towards his limo was because his attorney intervened and said, Dan, this is a bad idea. A very bad idea, Dan. I learned that I should remove myself from Dan's grip while his attorney was distracting him. I also learned at that moment, during an unspoken conversation between my boss and I, that my boss was not there to look out for me. He was there to listen to any directive his boss, Dan Snyder, had given to him at my cost. The next day I learned, when I told a senior coworker about Dan Snyder's sexual advance, that I should, quote, not repeat this story to anyone outside this office door. That was when I also learned there was no one to go to about Dan Snyder's advance, no path to report the incident, so I learned to move on.
Tiffany Johnson, part of her opening statement at today's House Oversight and Reform Committee roundtable discussion. A former employee with the Washington football team, which officially changed its name this week to Commanders. During that discussion, several Republican House members on the committee expressing support for the witnesses and what they went through, but questioning why Congress was getting involved in this case and not focusing on other public policy issues of importance. Virginia Fox of North Carolina is a senior member of the committee.
Madam Chairman, today this committee is holding a roundtable to examine the Washington football team's toxic workplace culture. I'm truly saddened to hear these stories, and I agree with the participants who noted in their heart-wrenching statements that this type of behavior has no place in any workplace and is disgusting. The proper venue to explore these types of claims is in the courtroom, not before this committee. To my knowledge, there's no pending litigation regarding the events we've heard discussed today, nor does this committee have legislative jurisdiction over this issue. It concerns me that this committee is choosing to spend its limited time having this discussion on the NFL and second-guessing decisions when there are multiple Biden-caused catastrophes that desperately need our attention and oversight. And the witnesses here have begged for us to do something, and nothing is going to happen as a result of this committee. That's cruel to these people.
Congresswoman Virginia Fox at the House Oversight and Reform Committee roundtable discussion. Matthew Paris is the Washington football team, now Commanders, beat reporter for the Washington Times, and he's been covering today's House roundtable. He joins us now. Thank you so much. Your reaction, your takeaways from what you heard today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a pretty explosive affair. When they set up this roundtable, it was really kind of a question of what more was there to gain of this, what more would be revealed, what could Congress do. And today a new accusation was made against Daniel Snyder that was not previously known. A former cheerleader said that Snyder made a unwanted sexual advance toward her. So that's big stuff. We'll see what the NFL does if they do react to this. They haven't commented so far, but in the big picture, it really kind of puts the spotlight back on the team's past sexual harassment scandal, especially as they've rebranded to the Washington Commanders.
On that new allegation, you tweeted that you have Dan Snyder's response.
Yes, yeah. He called that and another accusation outright lies. He said he's apologized for the team's past misconduct, but that this instance didn't happen. And he's had, this is kind of a similar tone that he's kind of used all along. And he said he unequivocally denies having participated in any such conduct.
There are a lot of claims today that the NFL has been protecting the Washington football team. What are the facts about that?
Yeah, so it really all stems from this report that Beth Wilkinson either made or didn't make. She was the lead investigator into the Washington football team's misconduct. And so the NFL says that she did not compile a written report, but she just gave a series of oral findings to Commissioner Roger Goodell. That was not satisfying to a lot of people who participated in the investigation. They're calling for kind of a full transparency, kind of a report similar to what the NHL issued with the Chicago Blackhawks and their scandal there. So, you know, the NFL's response to this has a lot of people feeling as if Daniel Snyder got off easy, and so that's kind of where things stem from.
We're talking with Matthew Paris from the Washington Times. As you mentioned, Democrats and Republicans going back and forth today about whether Congress has a role to play in this issue. From what you heard, what is the potential for federal involvement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's one that kind of still has to be seen. You know, some Democrats questioned about the NFL's anti-tax exemption status, which is, could they do anything there with that? Are there at-large legislation that they could pass regarding NDAs used in the workforce, and that extends outside of the world of sports? But it kind of just remains to be seen of how much Congress wants to involve themselves into this matter. Will they issue subpoenas to, let's say, Roger Goodell to testify or anything like that? That kind of still needs to be seen.
And finally, Dan Snyder has owned the team for a couple of decades. He might not be too popular with some fans. By all indications, will he be the owner for a while now?
Yeah, it really just depends on if the NFL ever takes action. But he's not going to voluntarily sell. He's not going to go down without a fight. That's been his MO his whole tenure here in Washington. And so, you know, unless there's something earth-shattering, he's going to remain the owner for the foreseeable future. He's only in his 50s. And so, yeah, so far the NFL has, you know, I don't want to say put up with his behavior, but it has allowed him to continue to be in his position. And, yeah, we'll have to see. But I think people are discouraged for those who have wanted to see a change. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that, you know, he's going to step down voluntarily.
Matthew Paris is the beat reporter for the Washington football team, now named the Commanders for the Washington Times. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Washington Today continues in a minute.
Book TV, every Sunday on C-SPAN 2, features leading authors discussing their latest nonfiction books. At noon Eastern, on In Depth, Georgetown University law professor Cheryl Cashin will be our guest live, taking your calls and discussing race relations and inequality in America. Professor Cashin's many books include The Failures of Integration, The Agitator's Daughter, and most recently, White Space, Black Hood. At 10 p.m. Eastern on Afterwards, California Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna shares his book, Dignity in a Digital Age, where he looks at the digital divide in America and offers suggestions on how to close the gap. He's interviewed by founder and editor-in-chief of The Markup, Julia Angwin. Watch Book TV every Sunday on C-SPAN 2 and find a full schedule on your program guide, or watch online anytime at booktv.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. President Biden traveling to New York City today with the Attorney General Merrick Garland, talking about gun violence and anti-crime measures. The Justice Department earlier launching the National Ghost Gun Enforcement Initiative. Ghost guns are built privately from parts difficult to track, no serial numbers. President Biden talking about that during a visit to the New York Police Department headquarters in the city. Also joining him, New York Governor Kathy Hochul and New York City Mayor Eric Adams.
Ghost guns are the guns everyone in this room knows that can be purchased in parts assembled at home, no serial number, and can't be traced. And they're as deadly as any other weapon out there. But the fact is, they are out there. And, you know, this spring, the Justice Department will issue a final rule to regulate these so-called ghost guns. But there's more we can do. Across the country, police departments report sharp increases in the number of ghost guns found at crime scenes. That's why today the department is launching an intensified national ghost gun enforcement initiative to determine and deter criminals from using those weapons to cover their tracks. If you commit a crime with a ghost gun, not only are state and local prosecutors going to come after you, but expect federal charges and federal prosecution as well. We've also created a strike force to crack down on illegal gun trafficking across state lines. As the mayor said, as he pointed out, guns that are used to kill people in New York City, they aren't made in New York City, they aren't sold in New York City, they are sold in other places. Today, the Attorney General directed all U.S. attorneys in the United States to prioritize combating gun trafficking across state lines and city boundaries. The Justice Department is sending additional prosecutorial resources to help shut down what's referred to, as you all know, the iron pipeline that funnels guns from shops in states like Georgia to crime scenes in Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York and so many other places. Governor, you worked with the mayor and the NYPD and 9 other states to create an interstate task force on illegal guns. That's the kind of leadership that's going to solve the problem. And I'm eager to hear more about that progress.
President Joe Biden in New York City today. The U.S. Justice Department saying that local law enforcement reported over 8,700 ghost guns in 2020, about 5 times the number from 4 years before. President Biden also saying, Mayor Adams, you and I agree the answer to crime is not to abandon our streets. That's not the answer. The answer is to come together. Police and communities building trust and making us all safer. The answer is not to defund the police. It's to give you the tools, the training, the funding to be partners, to be protectors, and to know the community. The director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Michael Carvajal, testified before Congress today. This comes about a month after he said he would be stepping down once a successor is in place. The New York Times writing that the resignation comes as the agency struggles with issues that have overshadowed his tenure, including employee misconduct, understaffing, and violence. At today's hearing, Congresswoman Karen Bass, Democrat from California, asked him about the policy of putting some inmates on home confinement during the height of the coronavirus pandemic.
One of the ways the CARES Act attempted to address the COVID epidemic within our prison system was by providing the BOP with additional authority to grant compassionate release for incarcerated persons who met a number of criteria to demonstrate a low risk of reoffense, as opposed to the way it was described a few minutes ago, Democrats asking for the prison doors to just be opened up indiscriminately. Can you tell me how many people within the BOP have been granted early release under this program? And I wanted to know, for those people that were granted, how many reoffended? I know there have been individual cases, but I want to know if you have any numbers overall or percentages of how many people were reincarcerated due to a technical violation, such as missing a curfew or a phone call, or how many people were released and are unaccounted for, how many people offended again with violent crimes.
Hey, thank you, Congresswoman Bass, and I appreciate the opportunity to make some distinctions here. I think that there is often confusion. I'm going to try to clarify what is going on here. First off, as I stated in my opening remarks, we released or transferred over 37,000 under the CARES Act to home confinement and community placement. Compassionate release is a separate entity. The BOP does not hold the authority to independently release someone from our custody. Under the statute and our current policy, we make a recommendation to the court. The court makes the final decision, not the Bureau of Prisons. The Bureau of Prisons doesn't take a position on the motion in and of itself. And as you stated, there is criteria. We use our policy criteria to evaluate and ensure that each individual case is compelling, extraordinary and compelling circumstances that they're fully considered. These are individualized cases. We also take into account public safety and victim impact, but I stress that we do not independently do that, and the court makes the final decision. We do not track data. I don't have it in front of me for compassionate release, because when the inmate receives a reduction in sentence, they're no longer in our custody. I can answer the other part of your question. Of the 37,000 that we transferred to home confinement in the community, approximately 9,000 of those were specific to the CARES Act. 320, approximately 320 that I'm aware of have committed violations, have been brought back to secure custody. 8 of those were new crimes that I'm aware of. One was a serious crime. I don't have the details in front of me, but I'm sure we could get them for you.
So you said again, 320. Could you repeat that again?
Yes, 320 of the inmates under CARES Act home confinement have reoffended and been brought back to secure custody.
And so you don't know of those 320, how many were technical violations that brought them back? You said 8 committed new crimes. Could I assume that the rest were technicals or not?
Yeah, I can clarify that. I appreciate that, Congresswoman Bass. Most of the most common offense, about 160 of those 320 were for abuse of alcohol or drugs. Some of them were escapes. They weren't where they were supposed to be. Most of them were violations of that nature. Some was misconduct. 8 of those were new crimes committed. The rest were technical violations.
Michael Carvajal is director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, questioned by Karen Bass at today's House Crimes Subcommittee hearing. Carvajal has been with the Bureau for 30 years, the last 2 years as director. Again, about a month ago, announced his resignation. He says once a new director is installed. From the Washington Post, the Federal Aviation Administration Administrator Steve Dixon testified Thursday before the House Transportation Committee on his agency's efforts to ensure that planes remain safe as wireless companies turn on 5G networks that could interfere with safety equipment. Aviation safety concerns led to the rollout of the fast wireless networks operated by Verizon and AT&T twice being pushed back during a months-long battle that pitted airlines against the telecom giants. When the companies were ready to flip the switch last month, the White House stepped in to secure limits on the deployment after airlines warned of chaos. That from the Post. The Transportation Committee chair is Peter DeFazio, Democrat from Oregon, and today he expressed his frustration.
Everybody else has taken measures to protect aviation, but we didn't until the last minute. And it's a temporary agreement, and something has to be worked out long-term in the next 6 months as they deploy more of these towers. They want to put them right in the flight path because, we want to get to that neighborhood over there. That's going to be a high profit center for us, so we want to have an antenna right there. There have to be some restrictions and agreements because we cannot have conflicting industries. Having a dropped call is way less serious than having a dropped airplane out of the sky.
Congressman Peter DeFazio at today's hearing. As the FAA works to ensure that the ground 5G transmitters near airports don't interfere with radio altimeters in planes, which are needed to land in poor visibility, there is now also a concern about passengers with 5G on their phones not putting it on airline mode. Here's a question to Administrator Steve Dixon from Congressman Carlos Jimenez, Republican from Florida.
Would you say that the telephones that are used by the passengers inside the airplane, I know we've for years been told we got to go on airplane mode, are the dangers now heightened because of this 5G as more and more passengers have 5G phones? And if they fail to heed the instructions of the flight crew, is that pose a danger to the airplane? To the aircraft? Could pose a danger to the aircraft?
Well, you're highlighting an issue that is actually part of the testing that we're doing, because what we have to do is the towers are generally smart towers. So if you look at 5G, as more demand is placed on the tower, the power will increase. And so if you have demand on the telecommunication system that's coming from the airplane, could that focus power on the aircraft as it's flying, in low visibility conditions? These are the kinds of things that you can only determine through the kind of flight testing that we're doing now. and with the telecommunications and aviation industry sharing information with each other. So I think it's an open question, but it is certainly one of the things that we're looking at.
The FAA Administrator Steve Dixon questioned by Congressman Carlos Jimenez at today's Aviation Subcommittee hearing. It's part of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. On Wall Street, the Dow falling 518 points, NASDAQ down 538, S&P down 111. CNBC explains that U.S. stocks fell on Thursday as investors' renewed optimism on big tech names driven by a slew of strong earnings took a turn down after Facebook parent Meta Platforms reported disappointing quarterly results.
Lord bless you.
A performance Thursday morning at the annual National Prayer Breakfast. The story from the Washington Post writes that the National Prayer Breakfast was for decades a Washington tradition where politicians could set aside their partisan differences and find commonalities in their faiths. However, last year's prayer breakfast was held virtually because of the coronavirus pandemic, and Biden gave pre-recorded remarks where he acknowledged the dark, dark time. Weeks before, a pro-Trump mob had overrun the Capitol, seeking to stop the confirmation of Biden's Electoral College win, an attack that led to the deaths of 5 people and injuries to dozens of law enforcement officers. This year, the breakfast was co-chaired by Senators Mike Rounds, Republican of South Dakota, and Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat from New York. They made some opening remarks.
Good morning. You can tell that the Senate is in charge because we're already 20 minutes late. My name is Mike Rounds. I'm from South Dakota. Each year, the National Prayer Breakfast provides an opportunity for us to come together, Republicans and Democrats alike, and pray for the success of our nation. For 70 years, the Prayer Breakfast has been a place where we set aside politics and focus on what binds us together, not what divides us. The tradition of the National Prayer Breakfast dates back to President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who at the time confided in one of his close friends, Senator Frank Carlson, that the White House was the loneliest house that he had ever lived in. Senator Carlson responded, "Mr. President, I think this may be the right time for you to come and meet our prayer group." And that's just what the president did. In this group, he found individuals who were willing to offer their nonpartisan support for our president, the leader of the free world, because they knew that's what was best for our country. The job of the president is not easy, and you often find yourself in the midst of difficult political situations. However, as the president, you should still be able to count on our prayers for the success of our country. This event allows us to recognize our common bonds, to offer our prayers for one another, our president, and our nation. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and I are here together in this effort. We both understand what our founding fathers believed in: the right of each of us to worship the good Lord the way that we see fit, whether it be in a church, synagogue, mosque, mountaintop, temple, or cathedral. We believe that all are welcome here in our country and in the spirit of Jesus to this prayer breakfast. Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Can you pull that? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It's been my honor to be co-host of the National Prayer Breakfast this year, and it's my honor to welcome you all here today. I want to start by thanking Senator Rounds for his partnership in putting this event together, and I want to thank all of you for being here to worship with us, to lift up the President and the Vice President, and to heal our nation.
Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Mike Rounds, co-chairs of this year's National Prayer Breakfast, held Thursday morning on Capitol Hill. We've got the full video with speeches by President Biden and Vice President Harris, other congressional leaders, and a keynote by Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative. You can find it at cspan.org. One clip that is making some news is President Biden praising the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell.
And Vice President Harris, Majority Leader Schumer, Mitch McConnell. Mitch, I don't want to hurt your reputation, but we really are friends. And that is not an epiphany we're having here at the moment. You've always done exactly what you've said. You're a man of your word, and you're a man of honor. Thank you for being my friend.
President Biden at the National Prayer Breakfast. Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, a Republican, pointing to political divisions and calling for healing in his final State of the State address. He gave it virtually Wednesday night from Annapolis due to the coronavirus pandemic.
Our nation is bitterly divided. We need to find a way to fix the broken and toxic politics that is tearing us apart. We need to restore trust and fairness to our political system by allowing voters to pick their elected representatives rather than having politicians pick their voters. Gerrymandering is partisanship at its worst. It's a cancer on our democracy. And Maryland has the unfortunate distinction of having the worst, most gerrymandered districts in America. Maryland legislators had the chance to right that wrong. We introduced fair maps, which were created by Maryland's nonpartisan Citizens Redistricting Commission. But legislators replaced them with maps that they drew up in secret behind closed doors, which have been universally criticized, receiving a flunking F grade by the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. These maps make a mockery of our democracy. Fortunately, the courts, not the legislature, will be the final arbiter.
Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, part of his State of the State address Wednesday night. He is finishing up his 8th and final year as governor, is term limited, can't run for a 3rd consecutive term this year. Hogan giving the speech in the old Senate chamber in the Maryland State House, which was where, in 1783, then General George Washington resigned his commission to Congress as a commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, signaling the transition from a military rule to a civilian rule in the new United States. Thank you for listening to Washington Today. For more top Washington stories, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.